A new survey is giving us new insights into America's political and generational divide, especially when it comes to young voters. The survey of 18,000 Americans finds that Trump supporters born after 1981 are more in favor of socially conservative values and hierarchical gender roles. 26% believe the man should lead and the woman should follow. That's twice the rate of older Trump voters. And researchers say more younger voters in both parties show an openness to political violence. The report concludes with this. The ultimate question is not what Trump will do, but what kind of country his supporters and all Americans want to build together. Joining me now is Stephen Hawkins, the Global Director of Research at More in Common, the group behind that study. Also with me, Democratic strategist and author of the Salty Politics newsletter on Substack, Julie Roginski. So, Stephen, the report states Trump supporters are not a cult. You say they are a coalition. Walk us through what stood out to you in your findings.
That's right, Chris. We did a study of more than 10,000 Trump voters, and what we found was that the importance of MAGA identity is actually pretty small relative to what you might think. Just 2 in 5 Trump voters say that it's important to them, and so we wanted to break apart this coalition and differentiate between the subtypes. And so we find a MAGA hardliners group, which is about 29% of Trump voters, an anti-woke conservatives group, which is about 21%, mainline Republicans, which are 30%, and then finally this fourth group, which we call the reluctant right, which is just 1 in 5, 20% of Trump voters. And by doing this analysis, we can break apart all of the heterogeneity that we see within the Trump coalition and not speak about it with too broad strokes, which sometimes misses a lot of the nuance.
Well, let me ask you one very specific question, because there has long been this question about MAGA and the far right, that these attitudes that the left sees as sexist, racist, homophobic, and even violent have always been there. It's just that Trump has been giving people permission to be open about those beliefs. Is that right? Or are beliefs shifting right? Or was there a moment that sparked this shift, like the COVID pandemic? Do we know where this is coming from?
I think historians and sociologists will spend a lot of time trying to unpack exactly what the causal origins are of some of these trends. But what we can say is that it's not simply a function of Trump creating a permissive environment for his supporters, because rather than seeing these trends across his entire coalition, what we're seeing are generational trends. And to specifically speak about the one about support for violence, or the belief that violence might sometimes be necessary, which is the specific wording, we see that that's really generational. And so I think one key trend that we're seeing is that younger voters, especially Gen Z, are not seeing a political system that's functioning well for them. And they're asking questions about where the flaws are in the system and what might be needed to overcome them. And I think that's part of the explanation for this surprisingly high level, 1 in 5 younger Americans saying that sometimes violence might be needed in politics today.
I'm curious what you think, Julie, as someone who works with politicians. Do you say, as a party, as the Democratic Party, that's the Trump base, that's the 30%, that's the 20%, we're never going to win them over, we just move on with the people who are winnable? Or do you have those conversations?
Well, it's interesting because according to the study, 50%, more than 50%, are either reluctant or just mainstream Republicans, which means that they're just voting for the jersey, right? Somebody's got an R after their name and they vote for them. Are they, after everything that's happened with Trump, are they persuadable? I mean, if you weren't persuadable after January 6th, I'm not sure, but I think we'll see this year that some of them are persuadable because some of them have just been reaching the limit of what they're accepting in their own lives under Donald Trump. What is more disturbing to me, I think, is this notion of the question that you asked, can you work together? Can you move forward together? I don't know there's much of an appetite in at least the Republican Party to work together. And I don't know that there's much of an appetite as a result of that in the Democratic base, though not necessarily among our elected officials, to work together.
Then how do they look at that? How should Democrats look at this study to frame what maybe they need to do as they look to win over young voters, and in particular, young male voters?
Well, look, the reality is that it is true that government has not worked for young voters. It just hasn't. These people were born after 9/11. All they've known is war and strife and economic uncertainty. And in the last 25 years, it has there's never been one good day of when people looked around, young people, and said, wait a second, things are great. I remember being around in the 90s, in my 20s, and saying, you know what, life's actually, I thought about that. Life's not bad. Like, things are good. I can't imagine that somebody in their 20s today would say that. And so I completely understand where they're coming from. I also think you have as Steve Bannon said in The Atlantic this week, a maximalist approach by Republicans to push the limits as far as it'll go and move the Overton window without any pushback. And Democrats allow them to continue to do that. So if Republicans are going to have a maximalist view, why don't Democrats have a maximalist view of democracy with a small d, act like it, defend it, and move the Overton window so far this way that eventually it has to move a little bit more towards where rational people are. But right now, the Republicans are moving it way to the right. Democrats are trying to, quote unquote, work with them to meet them halfway, which means that they're already moving to the right and doing that. Democrats need to really embrace the same kind of maximalist view in order to get young voters to believe, wait a second, there's another vision here. It doesn't have to be this dystopian dark vision. There is somebody to follow here who truly believes what he says and isn't just Republican light at this point.